Good morning, everybody. My name is Mary Jane Burke. I'm happy to welcome you here this morning. We're going to have an opportunity to hear directly from Dr. Lisa Santora, one of our public health officials, about how it is that we'll handle situations that come forward when someone has either symptoms of COVID or tests COVID positive. And so let me just tell you a little bit about Lisa. She is the Deputy Public Health Officer. She's been with our community since 2015, and our community has been stronger and better since she arrived. She was the former Chief Medical Officer at Beach Cities Medical Health District for 7 years. And she comes to us with a master's in public health from State University of New York in Buffalo. Lisa, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. This session will be recorded as a reminder and will be available along with any handouts on the website by tomorrow for sure. So with that, I'm going to pass this off to Mike Grant, a member of the Rethinking Schools team here at the county office. Thank you, Mike.
All right, thank you, Mary Jane, and thank you, Lisa, so much for being here. I'm just going to give our agenda for today's discussion is basically to have Lisa provide an overview about the importance of contact tracing and the team that she has assembled to do that, how we can, in the school setting, help mitigate risk of transmission, and how a critical aspect of this topic will be to identify a school and district liaison with public health in the event of a exposure or potential exposure. I'm going to give a little bit of a background and results to date from our 3 different programs that we've operated over the past few months. And then Melina Boyd on our Rethinking Schools team, who's helped develop the protocols and the cohort tracking, will go over some of the nitty-gritty detail about how it works. And then we'll have some time for questions and answers. So I'm going to pass this over to Lisa Santora. Lisa, great to see you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, everyone, and thanks for being here today. We have been in partnership with Marin County Office of Education long before COVID-19. The schools have always been critical partners in protecting the health and well-being of our community, especially where it relates to preventing the transmission of communicable diseases. And to that end, we've always had a nurse, a public health nurse, who's led our immunization program and works closely in partnership with Marin School Nurses Organization and the school nurses to ensure that our children are vaccinated and ready for school, and also to respond to any outbreaks. We have had outbreaks before in our school setting, for example, in measles, our Disneyland fund a few years back, as well as managing H1N1, which is a little further back in 2009. So we're not in uncharted water at all. We're working just with a new virus that we're learning a lot about, and a lot that has been reassuring us. So the partnership that I described begins in our communicable disease department, where we have public health nurses, and we are working to increase our public health nurse staff specifically to provide supports to the schools, because we are in a phase where we're still in the containment phase of COVID-19, which means we are actively engaged in identifying cases as quickly as possible, isolating those cases, quarantining their close contacts, and that's the part of what we call case investigation and contact tracing. And we have been working with the schools to develop the best protocol since we launched in March our pop-up childcare for essential workers, where we worked in partnership with the schools and some of the other childcare providers across the community to develop a response protocol and implement response protocols and learning lessons quickly on to prepare us for both the youth activities and school camps and childcare expansion that you've seen this summer, as well as to prepare for the fall. One of the key parts, and I think why we are going to be relying on having a single point of contact for each school, is something we call the line list. The line list becomes our heartline in contact tracing, where we're working to identify all staff and students who may have been exposed to a known case. And in almost all cases, and this will happen in every environment, I just came from another work site, cases are introduced usually into a work site or into a school site from the outside. So it's our activities on the outside, our engagement with household contacts, people, especially as we start reopening Marin County, people are engaging in more social activities. And as we move into the summer, we will be seeing the risk of the introduction of COVID-19 into a school environment. And so knowing and being able to quickly identify who is the case, and that's by testing. And you've seen we've dramatically increased testing availability by identifying who are the close contacts of that case. So for example, in our pop-up childcare, we have a roster of all the children. We know the dates they've attended school. So we're able to identify the point of when someone is infectious and that exposure period, and then identify any children or staff that need to be tested, and determining the right time to test them. That's something we also learned. Sometimes you can test too soon. It takes around 8 days after being exposed to COVID to develop enough virus if you become infected yourself, and to be able to test positive. And then that's where we work to make sure people are isolated and quarantined. And this is very different from the flu. In many ways in my head, I see coronavirus and flu very similar. And the things that I'm describing to you, we don't do this with the flu at all. We encourage everyone to get flu vaccines. We encourage kids not to come to school when they're sick, which we always encourage to do. But we're not implementing long quarantines or shutting down cohorts. And again, as we move into the new school year, the cohorts become another tool for us to minimize the impact of the introduction of COVID-19 into a school community. The cohorts, so for example, in an elementary school, it would be a smaller cohort. Most elementary students can stay with their own classmates. And so that allows us to have a shorter list to work through and potentially only close one classroom or one cohort if there is a known COVID positive. And I just want to prepare everyone that this is how we're responding to COVID-19 now. As we learn more and there's more research published around how our community is responding and reacting to COVID-19, things will change. Just like in 2009 in H1N1, we saw school closures in the springtime, and then we saw schools reopen in the fall. And the evidence from that point in researching all of the school closures in 2009 showed that it was not an effective strategy towards reducing the transmission of H1N1 in the community. We still don't have that research. This is a newer virus for us to learn about. We're learning a lot more, all of which is reassuring as it relates to the school populations, where we're not seeing pediatric hospitalizations like we do with the flu. Where a lot of research is now suggesting that the schools are not, the word that popped in my head is petri dish, but that's because I'm a mom with a 7 and 9-year-old. Schools are not a primary source of transmission to adults. And so that's, again, still to be more research is required for us to confirm that statement. And that while we may be instituting this 14-day quarantine now in the beginning of the school year, as early as 2021 or as late as fall 2022, we may not be using that quarantine method and that long quarantine method as our public health tool. And that's really going to be dependent on research. And I was just in my presentation this morning, a lot of our strategies that we implemented, so sheltering in place, the mandatory face covering, slowly opening Marin County, are all strategies to slow the transmission of disease in our community and buy time. And by buying time, it allows us to learn more about this disease and, again, how to implement the best practices in order to maintain our community, to educate our children, and to return to normalcy while protecting our most vulnerable populations, which remain those older than 65. Of all of the 18 deaths in Marin County, the majority, 17 out of 18, have been over the age of 65. We only have one individual who is 64 and a half up until our last death, unfortunately. We were able to say it was a much older population that is has higher morbidity and mortality related to this disease. So this is a great segue slide for us. And this is where you saw the guidance document that was released last week with the 30 principles that we're going to be guided on. We in public health are going to be working closely with the Office of Education and the districts and labor in order to make sure we take all the steps necessary to ensure a safe, healthy environment for schools to learn. But we do know that, and I then, because of my experience with my 9-year-old and 7-year-old, really know that being in schools is where kids need to be. And there are many tools that we have, public health tools, including isolation and quarantine, that will ensure that it's as safe as possible. So the first thing is back to the basics. And I am never guilty of this, but I know parents are very guilty of this sometimes, is sending kids to school when they're sick. So we have a lot of control in not sending any kids to school sick and not doping them up on on Benadryl and Motrin and Tylenol before sending them to school, and really encouraging parents and to stay vigilant about this, even though it could impact their work. But we really need to make sure kids can stay home and that parents have a plan for childcare that may not include grandparents. And again, that's something as we're moving into school with COVID, we know that grandparents are most vulnerable if they are part of that childcare. So making sure parents have a plan if their children do get sick. There was guidance that was released from the governor on Friday that exceeded my expectations, now recommending everyone over the age of 2 wear a face covering. And I know that will be a challenge because as I mentioned, I have a 9-year-old son who has different strategies of using his face covering, but face covering will be part of our new normal as schools return, and we know it will be a challenge, and we will adjust and adapt, and everyone's going to learn best practices for convincing a 3rd grader not to fling a mask at their friends. Then the daily temperature screenings, and this is something, again, we are now, I just came into our emergency operations center and got screened myself for my temperature. I'm always 97.1. And so temperature screenings are part of our world now, but temperature screenings also increase the interactions and that social closeness between people. So as we launch into the new school year and as we continue through summer camps, we still will be screening for temperatures, but that might be something, again, if we look into the future, it may not be something that continues to be a practice, especially because we know and we're seeing consistently that many people now who develop COVID-19 are asymptomatic. And so that will always be one of our challenges with this disease, or have very mild symptoms. It might not be febrile. And then I think and I just came from another presentation, it's back to the basics. We know a lot of what can protect us. It is those basics. It's social distancing, so trying to maximize when practicable, maintaining that 6 feet distance. In some classrooms, it may not be 6 feet, it may be between 4 to 6 feet, but we're gonna have face coverings, and that's really important why the 4 to 6 feet is allowable and practicable, because if your face is covered, we're preventing any sneezing and coughing and those expectorants of mucus from being transmitted to others or from landing on other surfaces. So that's why face covering remains an important part of us. And then I can't overstate the importance of hand hygiene, and I can't I can't say how horrible we are at our hand hygiene. I was really good, and I'm looking inward. I was really good in February and March at washing my hands for 20 seconds. And it is our human nature to decrease our vigilance. But right now is the time, as we are reopening Marin, to stay more vigilant than ever in keeping our face covered, maintaining social distance, and washing our hands. And that is challenging for people to do. And then I think the last thing I want to say is, I think just in a message to this large of a group, we are reopening Marin, but that does not mean to substantially increase your social activity. The more you engage in social activity, the higher risk you have of bringing or exposing yourself to this virus. And so we really are still encouraging people to limit their bubbles, the social bubbles that you were described, really trying to limit the social activity that you're engaged in and be thoughtful about that. And when you do engage in an activity, to really to be vigilant about all those basics that we can do to protect ourselves. I think I got all those, Mike.
Okay, thank you so much, Lisa. So I'm going to really appreciate that overview. You know, just a quick update on the background. We're in our 65th day of operations now with kids. We had 14 cohorts for the pop-ups at 6 school sites. We just finished our spring pilot programs, and we're now in the midst of our extended school year programs. We've had 2 impacted cohorts. So overall, in those 65 days, we've had over 4,000 student days, and that equates to, as of today, 759 cohorts operating for a day in those 60. And in that time, we've had to cancel. There were a couple of COVID positive students. They were actually siblings at different cohorts that required us to shut those cohorts down and do contact tracing. So we lost 18 cohort days. That's a little over 2% cancellation rate, which we view as great data moving forward in supporting our school programs. So I'm gonna pass it over to Melina Boyd, who has really been on the ground to help develop this specific response when concerns come up about exposure or potential exposure. Melina Boyd.
Hello, everyone. So when we're thinking about bringing staff and students back to campus for site-based instruction, a lot of questions are going to come up, like, what if someone tests positive for COVID-19? From there, even more questions are going to come up, like, who do I call? Where do I direct people with more information? And why am I taking these steps? Due to the experiences we have gained from the emergency pop-ups, we've been able to work with public health to answer a lot of these questions and develop protocols and document them for response to COVID-19 exposure. We found that that most of these situations actually fall into 4 buckets, or what we call scenarios. In the apps, because we are a little bit short on time, I'm going to push through these really quickly, but please keep in mind that everything that I go over, we have supporting documents with expanded information and links to sample communications that are going to be available on our website. So let's go to scenario 1, which is the most common. And that's if a student or staff member either exhibits COVID-19 symptoms, answers yes to the health screening questions, or has a temperature of 100.4 or above. The actions you would take would be to send that student or staff member home and ask them to contact their healthcare provider and or public health to inquire about more testing. At this time, the cohort can stay open and there is no other action that is needed. Keep in mind that, like I said, that is the most common. Kids get sick. So this is a scenario you're going to see very often. With scenario 2, this is a little bit more of a complicated one. And it is if a family member or someone in close contact with a student or staff member tests positive for COVID-19. In this situation, what you would want to do is absolutely report this information to the administrator. You would want to send that staff or student home and ask them to quarantine. And again, ask them to contact their healthcare provider and or public health to inquire about more testing. In this situation, you would want to as well keep the cohort open. We do have sample communications that we will share on our website that you can use, that you would want to send out to the students' families and staff members, just letting them know what the situation is. For scenario 2, you also would want to find out a little bit more information about the close contact. For example, was this in a backyard, outside, with all your family members and there was no close contact, or did that person play go fish with the infected person? So you'd want to find out more information. Scenario 3, this is the big one. This is, if a student or staff member does test positive for COVID-19. This information would be reported to the administrator immediately. The families of the student and the staff and the people that the staff live with would want to quarantine, contact their healthcare provider. Public health would probably already be in the loop on this, but in this situation, the cohort would be closed for 14 days from the last exposure. In scenario 3, there would be 2 modes of communication. First, a phone call right away, and then we also have another letter that you would want to send by email. In scenario 3, you would also, public health would ask for all of the cohort trackers and attendance, and I'll talk about that in a moment. We can go to scenario 4 now. So this is usually a follow-up scenario to scenario 1, 2, and 3, and that is if a student or staff member tests negative for COVID-19. In this situation, the student or staff member may return to the cohort 3 days after the symptoms occur. However, if they are living with someone that is COVID-19 positive, they would have to continue isolation, and public health would guide us so that we would know exactly what that timeline would look like. In this situation as well, the cohort would remain open, and again, we have a negative test communication that you can use to send out to your student families and staff. Next, we'll talk about cohort tracking. So this is all contact information for the staff and students, as well as attendance records for both staff and students for at least the past 10 days of school. It's really great to start thinking now about the most efficient way to pull this data. We can go to the next slide and we can show you a sample. This is a cohort tracker, very similar to what we used with the emergency pop-ups. You can see it's a lot of contact information like date of birth, phone, email, address. This is all extremely helpful for the contact tracing team in order to reach out should there be a COVID-19 positive situation. Another mode of information that you'd be sending along would be the attendance records. Again, you could use something like this within Excel or Google Docs, or what you could also do is start looking at your attendance that you use and see if there's reports that you could be pulling that would have all the information that they would need. And again, we have all of this information that we will have on the website that you can either use these templates or craft something for yourself. Next slide. And this is just some more contact or information about our website and some other important documents that could be helpful as you start to think about reopening your school and your district. And then we also have the contact information for public health here. They've got a wonderful website and they have a direct line as well so that you can call them directly. Next, we will open it up for any questions for Lisa or Dr. Santora.
Yeah, so I'm looking at the chat box has a lot, there's a significant amount of questions. We're not going to be able to get to them all. And what I will say is we'll get these up on our FAQs and answer them to the best of our ability. So let's see here. I'll pick one here in the middle. So hypothetical. There are 3 classes, A, B, and C. Students do not move. Teachers rotate between classes. Student in class A has a positive test. Class A is closed for 14 days. Do all 3 teachers also quarantine for 14 days? Do you get that? Well, see, we're going to unmute Lisa here. Are you? Oops.
Sorry, I'm glad I was muted for a second. I had to think that one out.
Yeah, so you get the basic idea. There's 3 classes. The students stay where they are, but the teachers rotate, and a student in one class tests positive. So that class theoretically is close to 14 days.
I think this is where you're going to see us err on the side of caution very early in the beginning, and I think this is where we're going to quickly see some of the challenges of this cohorting and closure of classrooms because of potential impacts. If our definition, and theoretically with the new recommendations from the state, et cetera, our definitions of close contact is that it's spending 15 minutes without a face cover and less than 6 feet. And that being said, a lot of the interactions that might happen in the classroom would not meet that criteria, but we would close the classroom. So we would close classroom A. And this is where I think there's some of the challenges would be if all 3 teachers rotated, unless they could very clearly articulate that they did not have that level of contact, we would have those 3 teachers also be part of that quarantine in the beginning of these phases. And I think this is going to be the challenge for all of us, is we are going to err on the side of caution using these 14-day closures in the beginning, and that may evolve as we learn more about this disease in the weeks to months to come.
Okay.
Lisa, this is Mary Jane. Do you have a chance? Would you have some time right now to go just a little bit longer so
Yes,
we
I
can
do.
get to more of these questions?
Yes,
Thank you
of course.
very much.
And I
That would be
apologize. I came from one site to this, so I apologize to everyone for starting.
no, that would be great, just so we can get to more questions. Thank you.
Okay, so I see another one here, and this came up a little bit yesterday. Is how is 4 feet scientifically acceptable when 6 feet is the standard?
I think you have to look at what we're trying to protect. The majority of transmission, we believe, is through droplets. And so the best way we used to spread the flu before we institute a lot of the measures that we have now is people sneeze, people talk, and when they talk, they spit, and people cough, and then the droplets fly. And now what we're doing, which is a major change for us as a society, is that we're wearing face coverings. So the face coverings is that first protective space where when we're talking or possibly sneezing, droplets are not being projected. And there's great research that shows that that's a very effective strategy. The 6 feet, and I was on the call yesterday, everything in our Centers for Disease Control, even the quarantine times, the distancing that's recommended is based on erring on the highest side of caution, as this is a new disease. And that's why we have taken such strict measures in the beginning. It's always erring on the furthest side of caution. And even if I were talking to you right now, the likelihood of me spreading, if you're 4 feet away from me, of my droplets going to you, especially if I'm covered with a mask, is very low. And again, this is where it's our risk-benefit ratio that we are weighing together as a community. And we really know that classrooms are the best place for students to be for their emotional, physical health and health development. And so that's the place that we're working together to create the safest environments together. But that's why, again, the 6 feet is the widest level of precaution. You think of yourself if your face is covered and you're not sneezing and you're covering your coughs and you have good respiratory etiquette, the likelihood of that droplet going beyond your that 4 feet is lower. So the further we can get out, the lower risk there is.
Okay, there's a quick one. How large were those cohorts? The data that I shared was for the pop-ups and the spring pilots in our current ESY extended school year programs. They're cohorts of 12. So, and let's see, what will be done for children with asthma or who are immunocompromised?
And I think this is a place where we are very highly reassured in the pediatric specialists and pediatricians and physicians at large. We anticipated in the beginning that there would be a negative synergistic effect between COVID-19 and asthma. And that is not what we're seeing. We're not seeing asthma exacerbations triggered even in adults with COVID-19. It's not the picture that we've seen, even though that was one of our hypotheses that we're preparing for. We're also seeing most children are asymptomatic when they are infected and are not and it doesn't appear that, again, from early evidence. And this is why we're still buying time. We're learning. If you go to PubMed, which is one of my favorite places to go to see the body of research that's available, we're learning more and more. But we don't see, unlike the flu, where children under the age of 5 can be severely affected by the flu. We're not seeing that same manifestation in the pediatric population or the youth population. It generally is very mild symptoms.
Okay,
and
so
without that synergy with that synergy with asthma. So we would recommend the same guidance for all asthmatic children returning to school, that they have their trigger plan, that they have their medications, they visit their doctors, but we have not seen asthma being synergistically negative.
okay, so this is another question. When staff is sent home, who's teaching the class? The answer to that would be a substitute or another staff member. What if parents, so this goes, Lisa, to a question that's come up before having to do with confidentiality and FERPA. What if parents don't communicate exposures to the school? How are HHS departments sharing exposure information?
So we, as public health, get notified of all positive results, regardless if people are tested inside our county, outside our county, outside of our state, and internationally in the beginning. So we are notified of any positive results, and that positive result is our first trigger. Many times parents will know about the results first before us, just because of, for example, they might be a Kaiser member and their results get posted right to their Kaiser website, and then they may know before us. And we depend on people promptly notifying us, but we have systems, a safety net system that we'll be notified within a day of a positive result.
Okay, so I know we maybe just have another time for another question or two. And again, there's too many questions on this. We'll try to get all these in the FAQs. What about false negatives? Isn't there a high incidence of those?
Our test is best when we test individuals that are symptomatic with COVID-19, and we test them 8 days after their exposure to the disease, because that means the virus has enough time to replicate in their body. And that's when we have the lowest false negative rate. And the screening though, when we test an asymptomatic, can have a higher false negative rate. So that's part of any test. And that's why all the tests that we have are for emergency use only testing. And again, we're learning more and more about testing and improving testing technology, but there is a risk of false negatives. Again, I think the return to school is also predicated that the severity of this disease, again, in the pediatric under 65 population is significantly lower than we anticipated. And that's for 2 reasons. One, I think we are seeing in the first phase, we saw an older population affected in Marin County. So we saw higher rates of hospitalization based on the numbers of people that were positive. And then, so we have a younger population that we now have more information about that we didn't have. We're testing better in the United States than China ever tested. And so you have to take it with a grain of salt, the data that you do see. So we're testing more people. We know more about this disease. And again, more than 80% of people are generally asymptomatic with mild disease. The exception to that is the over 65 population. The second thing, and this is not proven out yet, but there is a hypothesis that the mutations that are very common in viruses to happen is that it is not as it's no longer causing the same level of morbidity as it previously did and when it entered into the United States. That is a hypothesis, but has to be proven out. And then the third thing is it's also potentially a cold weather disease. And that's why, again, even though we're easing restrictions with shelter in place, we are encouraging our community to stay vigilant. We are preparing for a fall season where we're going to be learning how does the flu season interact if COVID is still in existence in our community. How do those diseases interact together? And so there's, again, still a lot for us to learn. The other thing I think for this group to be aware of, when we're testing people that are symptomatic, we still are seeing only 5% of people test positive for COVID-19. And there's all those other things that affect us every year where most of the summer flus are out here. So we have enteroviruses that are those summer flus that we get. We have coronaviruses and rhinoviruses that we get sick with. And I hope one of the silver linings is as we're being more vigilant with our hand hygiene and social distancing, that we'll have less of those diseases, and entering also a school year with potentially less lice is another silver lining as a mom who has combated lice as kids maybe not be as close to each other. So, but we have to stay vigilant about all those diseases and know that COVID-19 is another part of our regular disease ecology in our community, including all the viruses that I listed, and then another favorite of norovirus, which is another one that we manage. And again, it's all those tools that public health tools that we use every single day. That's part of our toolbox to stay safe. And again, just staying vigilant and being more conservative in our measures as we rethink school and start opening up again.
Okay, Lisa, thank you very much. Thanks to all of you who are participated. The information will be on the website by tomorrow, including the Q&A section, which is on each of the trainings that if you've had a chance to participate in others. You'll see after each session, there's also a Q&A there available to you. So thank you very much, Dr. Santora. Thanks to the team. Next week or next Thursday, there will be a session like this that will be focusing on what, Mike?
You mean this Thursday, right?
Yes, this Thursday.
Yeah, so this will be how to conduct a school site walkthrough to prepare for reopening, bringing kids back to site-based instruction.
Okay, Lisa, sorry, one more question. There's several questions here about cloth coverings, face masks, face shields. Can you just talk about that from your perspective? There's a lot of interest in face shields for our teachers so the kids can see them, see their expressions, etc. So and I do know that part of the EPE that the state is providing does include face shields for teachers. So could you say a bit about that?
Yes, I think this is where we're looking for technology to improve, as well as science catching up with our needs. And so face shields are suboptimal in some ways because it doesn't cover, if you ever see that picture of the sneeze, it spreads, and it disperses and it's kind of in a centripetal way. And so that there could be potential exposure if someone's only wearing the face shield of droplets falling down if they're wearing that face shield. We are exploring new clear masks that teachers especially could be able to wear so we all can see each other. We're such social creatures, and not seeing our mouths and not seeing, especially if someone might have hearing impairments or other things, looking for those other alternatives. And again, I think this is where we are at this phase in the pandemic, and it's going to evolve, where we're taking every precaution wearing these face covers. We'll be looking for alternatives. There's sometimes where a face cover is not practicable. And so that's something we'll be working together, and sometimes it's looking at a harm reduction approach rather than really conceiving that we can stop the spread of virus completely. And again, that's something that again is reassuring us, is seeing the high levels of asymptomatic and mild disease in the community.
Lisa, this will be the final question and very specific to you. Are you planning on sending your kids back to public school with a cohort of 25 to 30? What is your comfort level?
So I've already sent my children back to camp this summer with the cohort of 12. I would have personally been comfortable if, because if you can imagine, some of our orders are staggered. So some of the orders that are in place for the opening of summer camps are more restrictive as than what is the guidance that's being provided for the school year. I would have been comfortable with my children attending a larger camp, having 25. My kids are elementary school kids, so they would have been in that 25 age group. And I think that's because, again, I've learned a lot about the disease in the past weeks and months. I've been in, and I think this is part of the challenge as we begin to adapt as a community to this disease. Some of us have been out in the community and working, and it's learning more and learning how you can best protect yourselves and your family as you go out into the workplace, which I've been doing since the beginning of this. And I also have my kids cared for by my parents who are over the age of 70. And even though they've started this camp, they've also seen their grandparents. They wash their hands. They're not kissing them, but they're allowed to give them hugs. I watch them when they hug. And we make sure we go back to those basics. This is a virus. The virus we're learning more about, but it is us washing our hands, staying distanced. So my kids are not allowed up on their grandparents because those are the ones who are at risk. It's my parents who are at risk with my behavior and my kids' behavior. And again, spending time together, but that's my bubble. I'm not going out with my friends. I'm not socializing in other ways, just so I can minimize the introduction of this virus to my parents. And again, I'm looking to buy time for my parents until we have a vaccine that may be effective for them to protect them better from this virus. So they'll be in school when school opens on, was it August 18th?
Right, absolutely. It's a different date for different districts.
Sorry.
So there have been many requests to please give us more time to try to get to more questions. So we'll try to figure out how to make that happen. Lisa, thank you very much. To my team, thank you for all you're doing to try to help get the word out. And thank you all for joining us. Look forward to seeing you again on Thursday.